It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Irene Lusztig, who's here in the station. Irene, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
Irene, you teach in the Film and Digital Media program here.
I do.
And you are here to talk about a wonderful exhibition that's happening at the Sesnon Gallery, and that you were able to curate. You're the curator, and the name of the exhibition is called Complicated Labors, Feminism, Maternity, and Creative Practice.
So do you want me to talk about the show or how the show started?
Sure, that would be great, Irene.
So I guess in many ways I think about the show, and the show is, there's also a symposium that happened last week, and I think I very much thought about both of those things as kind of spaces of conversation and ways of staging a conversation. And I think a lot of artists curate or think in terms of curating, and in some ways this is a new kind of project for me. I've never curated a gallery show before, but I do think I've really thought of it as kind of an extension of my own practice as an artist, and maybe a way of thinking about who else works on things that are similar, and really like what is the way to make a conversation. So I'm not just, I think a lot of artists and a lot of art making is something that people do alone or in isolation, and thinking about making a bigger context of other people has been really rewarding and interesting to do.
Irene, you're a filmmaker.
I am.
And a big part of this work is from possibly inspired by your movie, The Motherhood Archives. Is that?
In some ways. So there's two, I'm a filmmaker. I made a film called The Motherhood Archives. I started this film when I got pregnant, so there was a kind of personal point of origin in terms of my work on that project. But I also made a second project that's a web-based project called the Worry Box Project. That's at www.worrybox.net. And that is a participatory archive of women's maternal anxieties. So it's a space that collects women's anxiety dreams and fears and worries around maternity. And it's very inclusive. It's, some of the women who submit things are mothers, and some are not mothers, who are either anxious about having children, not having children, their relationship to maternity.
Irene, that was at the Worrybox?
Worryboxproject.net.
Worryboxproject.net.
Yeah, so these are two different projects that I think are in conversation with each other, and maybe two parts of a body of work that thinks about maternity and motherhood and how we talk about motherhood. And I would say the show more came out of the second. Out of the Worry Box. Yeah, so the Motherhood Archives is actually not in the show, although it's obviously really related thematically to the show. But the Worry Box Project is in the show.
Complicated Labors.
Yeah, so I think in terms of the show, what I was really thinking about, and kind of why the film didn't fit so well, is I think I was really thinking about the idea of work and labor and process, and thinking about that both in terms of work and labor and process that we do as artists, and then of course work and labor and process that we do as mothers, and how those two things connect or don't connect, or how one can come out of the other. So all of the work in the show in different ways is work of artists who are really negotiating those things and kind of thinking about how to make work as artist mothers, and how to use the work of motherhood as a space that's generative for art. And the film kind of, which I'm happy to talk about, but the film kind of didn't quite fit into that.
Okay, and so people can go to the Sesnon Gallery, which is over in Porter College, and the show will be up it began February 5th, and it'll be up all through February until March 15th. So it's a good almost month and a half that'll be at the Sesnon Gallery. And when you go there, you'll be able to see quite a few featured artists that you yourself curated, correct? Do you want to go through a little bit of some of the people?
Yeah, I mean, one really important thing in the show, and I will say I'm the curator, but I have a kind of invisible and unofficial co-curator, who's Natalie Loveless, who's another one of the artists in the show, who's actually a History of Consciousness alumna. So
right.
Yeah, so she's a UCSC alumna, she's now a professor in Alberta, and she's kind of my secret collaborator.
And a great performance artist.
Yeah, and she's done a lot of curating around maternity, so she was kind of a really amazing resource, because she was much more, and one way the show started was I actually had trouble getting my film screened, and I actually, it was a kind of complaining conversation I had to her about how, the art world doesn't take maternity seriously, people are so dismissive of this kind of work, and she was already really plugged into this kind of world of mother artists and maternal art, and she had curated a show in Toronto in 2012 called New Maternalisms. So some of the artists in our show are from that show. But one thing we really wanted to do at the show that was not in the 2012 show is I was really interested in also thinking about a kind of intergenerational component, and again in terms of what kind of conversation are we having and who's in the conversation. I was really interested in kind of bringing together a few artists who were kind of pioneering feminist artists who were making art in the 70s and kind of very early kind of public mother artists who are making work about motherhood.
And who was that?
So Mary Kelly is probably the biggest name artist in the show. She, I think, really is kind of the first that I can think of kind of feminist artist to make work about maternity, or at least to make kind of conceptual artwork about maternity.
It's interesting because feminists originally, if you read Simone de Beauvoir, was very, to be a feminist, you could not be a mother.
Exactly, yeah.
So
yes.
Would you say it was the second wave of feminism that started, or maybe not even then?
Not even that. I think it's always been marginal, and it's always been a really problematic space of conversation. This kind of, are those two things mutually exclusive? And three things, in fact. Like, can you be an artist and a mother? Is it possible to do both? Can you be a feminist and a mother? Are those two things mutually exclusive?
Right.
So, so all of those things are problematized, I think, through the history of feminism.
So Mary Kelly did it anyways.
So she did it,
She's a pioneer.
So in 1974, she made Prima Para, which is a series of sequence of photographs, and then her big project, of course, was Postpartum Document in 1976. Which was a really, really big conceptual art project covering multiple years in her son's life. And, and I think she's really, in many ways, been a role model for a lot of young feminist artists, I think, both because of the kind of feminist content, maternal content, but also because she's an incredibly rigorous, I think, conceptual artist and rigorous thinker. And the fact that she's able to kind of do both of those things in the same space, and that she did it in the mid-70s, is incredibly impressive. So she was really generous about showing her work at the Sesnon.
So what will we get to see?
So Prima Para is a sequence of, I think, 22 photographs. There's a sequence, a bathing sequence, and a fingernail cutting sequence. And it's just two series of photographs, kind of small-scale photographs of her son when he's an infant. And she also came for the symposium, which was incredibly great. So she was here last week. So she, and I think her work really anchors the show. And then the other artist that we were really excited to show, who unfortunately couldn't come for the symposium, is Mierle Laderman Ukeles, who, and we're showing a really wonderful and kind of important and influential piece of hers, which is her Manifesto from 1969. It's a text-based piece that's called Manifesto for Maintenance Art that she wrote in 1969. And the way she describes it in her bio is that this was a piece really written in a space of rage, which I love. And I really like the idea of kind of reclaiming this kind of space of maternal rage. But in her own bio, she describes that she kind of fell out of the avant-garde after having a child and felt really kind of ignored and dismissed. And in a state of rage, kind of wrote this manifesto where she really makes a kind of amazing claim about the work that she does at home, kind of the domestic labor, what she calls maintenance work, cleaning, washing her child, mopping up vomit, whatever else she does in the house. She makes a claim for those activities as kind of things that she, from now on, plans to consider art making or a space of art making.
That's fabulous. Irene Lusztig talking today. Just want to make sure the audience knows that she's an assistant professor of film and digital media here at UCSC, and we're talking about her exhibition that's up at Sesnon through March 15th at the Sesnon Gallery in Porter College called Complicated Labors. And we're talking about the different artists that are featured in the gallery right now that you can go to. Let's just say that the gallery hours are Tuesday through Saturday, 12 to 5 p.m. Wednesdays, it's late. It goes Wednesdays from 12 to 8. And again, that's located at the Porter College at UC Santa Cruz. So those are kind of the two fundamental feminists back from the late 60s, early 70s.
I think, and there's still artists who are really well known now and have kind of interesting careers still. Mierle Ukeles, I think one thing that's really important to say about her is the other thing she does So besides kind of making a claim for this kind of domestic labor as potentially art labor or art practice, she then really extends that to thinking about ecology, thinking about the environment, thinking about care labor and maintenance labor in general. So she has a really famous performance project from, I want to say, the late 70s, early 80s, where she shakes the hand of every sanitation worker in New York City. So it's this kind of giant multi-year project where she's shaking hands with 8,000 sanitation workers and saying thank you for keeping New York alive. So she really extends this way of thinking into kind of much bigger realms of kind of caretaking labor, which I think is really important, because one of the questions in the show and kind of bigger political questions is how do we, as a society, value or not value the work that mothers do at home, which I think obviously if you think, nurturing the future generation of humans is incredibly important and difficult and important labor to be entrusted with, but it's obviously kind of economically and socially not valued.
Not valued, which is why we have feminists to help us learn about that.
And then the other, there's a collective that's also featured in the show that was also active in the 70s called Mother Art Collective, and 3 of the women from Mother Art Collective are still working together as a collective, and they came for the symposium. And they, I think, in some ways have been forgotten by art history. So it was really, and a lot of people came up to me after the symposium and were like, they're so wonderful. Why have I never heard of them? Why do I not know this work? So kind of unlike Mary Kelly, who's, I think, still kind of an art star, I think Mother Art Collective is not so well remembered, but also did really important work, and a lot of kind of performance public art practice. They did a big show in a laundromat called Laundry Works in the 70s, but again, really thinking about how to combine the space of the work they do with children and the work they're doing as artists.
So where is Mother Art Collective? Where was that based? Or
they're still based in Los Angeles, and it's now the 3 women who came were Suzanne Siegel, Deborah Krall, and Laura Szilagyi, and the 3 of them still work together as Mother Art Collective and still show. But again, I think that they're much less well remembered, but also really kind of pioneering feminist artists.
Well, it's good that we have you, Irene Lusztig, to remind us of these lost artists. So who else do we have?
So then together with these 3 kind of 70s kind of pioneering feminist artists, we really wanted to put that work kind of in conversation with and alongside work of younger emerging artists who are, I think, all mothers of young children, and kind of negotiating many of the same questions. And it was interesting, in the symposium last week, we really explicitly were kind of talking across kind of what was the 70s feminist project, what's going on now, and in fact very little has changed, is the ironic and sad and maybe obvious thing that we learned. But so a lot of these young artists, I think, are thinking through very similar questions of
we're still asking the questions. Can you be an artist and a mother?
Can you be an artist and a mother? How do you keep making work? What kind of work? Kind of what are the physical constraints of motherhood? How do you work around that? Can you work around that?
Can you use your kid?
Can you use your kid? Yeah, and that's a big question. Actually, one of my grad students, which I thought was really interesting, she came up to me afterwards and was like, I thought all of this work was really unethical, because there are quite a lot of artists who use their children in their work or perform with their children. And she was really, and I wish she had said this at the symposium, actually, because I think it's an incredibly interesting and complicated question.
Well, it's certainly one that my daughter has posed to me quite a few times. And
and the other, we had some writers. So the other thing that happened in the symposium is there was not only this kind of 70s and now conversation, but I also wanted writers and artists to be in the same space. And this did come up in the afternoon with all of the writers were asked to talk about what, how their children react to the fact that they write about the children. Do they think about what it will mean in the future for their children to have writing circulating that uses their children? Do they use their children's name? Do they let their children read their writing? How do they negotiate all of that? And that question didn't come up with artists, but it's also a really interesting conversation.
Sure. Or how about my daughter using me in her writing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which a lot of people do, It's like blame it on your mom,
Of course, yeah. I mean, there's a long history of blaming everything on your mom.
Well, you can. Freud said so.
Yeah. So the younger artists, there's an artist named Lenka Clayton who has a super, super fantastic project called Artist Residency and Motherhood. And that also has a website. It's, I think, artistresidencyandmotherhood.com .net, I don't know.
Lenka Clayton.
Lenka Clayton. So she's a British conceptual artist who's younger, and she has this kind of big umbrella project called Artist Residency and Motherhood, which is this kind of really fantastic and funny and smart conceptual art premise, which is that as an artist with young children, she's basically excluded from the whole structure of artist residencies, which typically are, that is the kind of institutional support that a lot of artists depend on. So they apply to residencies that are in kind of bucolic destinations, and you then go and live in a cabin wherever and do your work, and children are not welcome in the artist residency structure. Right. So her kind of conceptual premise is that she's doing a 2-year artist in residency in motherhood. It takes place in her house with her children, and all of the work she produces during that time is part of this residency. So it's, in fact, a series of many small projects that come out of that premise. And we have her artist statement as one of the pieces that we framed in the gallery, which echoes really, really nicely with the Manifesto for Maintenance work by Mierle Ukeles from 1969. So it's this kind of contemporary taking up again of some of those questions of economics, of how
40 years later.
Yeah, of how artist work is supported, and of what it might mean to be so bold as to just make the statement that what you're doing in your house every day with children might also be a space of art making.
Yeah, and that it's worthy.
Mm-hmm.
As worthy as making a lot of money.
Right. So her work is in the show. Natalie Loveless also is showing in the show. She has a 12-screen video piece that's a participatory blog and smartphone-based piece that's based on the idea of documenting performative actions as a kind of daily practice. And it's a piece where she invited 4 other mother artists with young children to also participate. So it's this kind of 4-way split screen piece on each screen, where it's kind of different people's contributions. And that piece also, I think, speaks really nicely to Mary Kelly's work. That's also this kind of very serial work of tiny frames.
Photographs.
And who else is showing in the show? Oh, Jill Miller, who's a Bay Area, Berkeley-based artist. She has a video piece in the show and also a series of photos. And those come out of a bigger project called Homeschooled. That's kind of her response as an artist to what she calls the cabin fever of homeschooling her child and being alone home with her son.
Yeah, it's tough.
So she has a series of photographs called Body Configurations with my son. That's a series of they're very funny. Her work is very funny. Kind of series of poses of her and her son in the home. And then she has a very funny video piece called Unsung Hero that intercuts kind of stock footage made by a GoPro company to sell GoPro cameras. So those are these extreme sports cameras that you wear on your head to film skateboarding or snowboarding. And she intercuts that stock footage with her own footage in the home while she herself wears a GoPro. And she's kind of trying to think about the process of mothering as maybe also a space of extreme sport. So.
That's great.
Yeah, it's very funny.
Irene Lusztig, she is assistant professor here at the Film and Digital Media program at UCSC. We're talking about her exhibition, which also included a symposium called Complicated Labor, right now at the Sesnon Gallery in Porter College, and it will be up until March 15th. I strongly urge y'all to go down there. It sounds like such a great exhibition. You have some wonderful people in.
Yeah. I'm trying to think if I missed anyone. There's, of course, my project. I think I missed myself. So I have an installation version of the Worry Box project in the gallery. And we also have a screening room in the back of the gallery.
Yeah.
Because there are really more artists than we could fit in the show, and we really wanted to include more work. So in the back of the gallery, there's a screening room that just shows a loop that's a compilation of several other artist videos.
So, Irene, you have a movie that we talked about at the very beginning of the show, Motherhood Archives, and that was screened at the Santa Cruz Film Festival last November.
Right.
And now you have a couple places you're going to be screening it in the Bay Area, right?
Yeah, so it is screening on February 18th in Oakland at the New Parkway Theater. And it is also screening at Other Cinema, which is a micro cinema in San Francisco, and that screening is on March 1st, I believe, at 8:30.
And you have all of this information is at your website, which is
Komsomolfilms.com.
Komsomolfilms.com. That's KOMSOMOLFILMS.com. And you have a wonderful website that shows a lot of your work, and you can find out where all of these events are. That you'll be able the Motherhood Archives screenings.
Yeah, and there's a Facebook page for the Motherhood Archives. That's just facebook.com/Motherhood Archives that keeps up to date with screenings that are happening.
And it's a feature-length documentary, would you call it, or?
It is, yeah. It's 91 minutes.
Excellent. We have just a couple more minutes left of our show today of Artist on Art. Irene Lusztig, would you just tell us a little bit about what you see, what you got your eye on right now for future projects? What are you thinking about?
So I think actually I'm starting a couple of new projects, although it's been very hard to find time to start new projects. But I'm starting a project that's about my family, that's connected to an earlier film I made. In 2001, I made a film about my grandmother called Reconstruction, that my mother was in. And this is a film about my grandfather, who my mother didn't know growing up, so she met him for the first time when she was 26. He was also a filmmaker, but he made kind of biology education films. So after he died, I was given a print of a film of his about snails that was given to me because nobody else knew what to do with it. But I think in some
wonderful.
ways, but in some ways it's a film thinking, partly I think about my mother's aging and maybe thinking about family, but thinking about family, I think, in the new ways that you think about family once you become a mother and start to think about your own mother as someone who's aging or getting older.
Right. Irene Lusztig, so you are assistant professor here at the Film and Digital Media. Are you teaching any classes?
I'm co-teaching a graduate class this quarter with an anthropologist, which has been really fun.
And how about next quarter?
Next quarter I'm teaching the senior projects class in documentary. So that's kind of an exit finishing class where students focus on one big project for the whole quarter.
So those are undergrads that are graduating in the film and digital media
Exactly,
program.
yeah. So it's the kind of last big project they do before they graduate.
Irene Lusztig, thank you so much for coming on the show today and talking about your exhibition. It sounds wonderful. It's called Complicated Labors, and you have an incredible lineup of featured artists, and you can go to the Sesnon Gallery at the Porter College Tuesday through Saturday, 12 to 5, and Wednesdays it's open late, 12 to 8 p.m. And you'll be able to see this wonderful exhibition. It goes up through March 15th. It's a good month, but don't hold out. You don't want to miss it. I'm gonna run over there right now and see it. I'm really sorry you missed the symposium, but please come back on when you have your next project, film, or symposium.
Thank you for having me.
It was wonderful talking to you, and it's really wonderful to talk to somebody about these issues or these, let's say, challenges that women artists, mother artists have in negotiating being an artist while also being a mother, and that it's still questionable and it's also still really hard. I mean, just you were saying about getting a residency. It's like, I'd never thought of that. But it's true. It's not like they're asking for your kids to come along. It's like...
Yeah.
Irene Lusztig, thank you so much again for coming on the show.